So welcome everyone. So this evening what we'll be looking at is an introduction to a 6-week series that we're starting next week. So you will have received an email for those of you on the mailing list yesterday and today about this. More emails will be coming out. So the purpose of today is to introduce essentially the material that we're going to cover, the purpose and structure of the series. In it, we'll broadly look at the general cause of stress as we experience it, some of the concepts and the practices that we're going to be discussing and hopefully practicing. And we're also going to touch on some of the homework aspects that we'll be implementing throughout the next 6 weeks. So let's just get straight into a little bit about the content that we're going to cover. So broadly speaking, what we want to understand when it comes to dealing with stress is that the root of dealing with stress is understanding it as a phenomenon. If you want to manage anything, you have to be able to measure it. You have to be able to understand it as deeply as we can. And so this essentially means understanding the etiology of stress. How does it arise? Where does it come from? What effect does it have on the personality? Once we understand these fundamental principles, we can start looking at ways to manage it. And so the first thing we ask when we talk about how does stress arise, or the first thing we ask about dealing with stress is to ask, how does stress arise? And for that, we can take a broader look and ask the question, well, how does any experience arise? And in the book Vedanta Treatise, The Eternities by A. Parthasarathy, he describes what he calls the traffic of life. So he describes the receipt, reaction, response mechanism, which we'll go into in a minute. So any experience that we have, whether it's a stressful, a non-stressful, a pleasant experience, whether it's physical, emotional, intellectual, comprises two aspects, a subject and an object. So when a subject and an object meet, an experience is born. And so stress is a particular type of experience. So in this composition of an experience, the subject is the individual, oneself, you, me. And the world is the object. So we are constantly meeting the world. And as I meet the world, I have an experience, as do we all. So the mechanism that he describes, the experiences that we have begin and end with the world. This is the thing that we most intimately know. From the moment we are born, what is it that we know? We know the world. Hence, the moment we wake up in the morning, what's the thing that we know? The world. Hopefully we don't immediately start screaming. But the point is that all of our experiences begin and end with the world. So the world provides us with stimuli. So this is the receipt portion of an experience. We receive stimuli from the external environment through the sense organs: eyes, ears, nose, tongue, and skin. Once we have received that stimulus, it travels, as it were, into the inner personality of the mind and intellect, where there is a reaction. So we have feelings about the thing that we have received, we have thoughts about it, we cogitate on it. Once we have fully reacted, and of course that reaction takes a split second, we then get into a response. So according to the reaction that we have, we respond back into the world. And the text here gives an example of reading a book. And in the same way, we could give the example of listening to this class. You receive the stimuli of my voice and the slides that are coming up. There's a reaction in the inner personality of mind and intellect. I like it, I don't like it. There's a reaction in the form of I understand, I don't understand. It makes sense, it doesn't make sense. And then your response will be, this is interesting, I'll keep listening, or okay, my video's off, he doesn't know, I'm going to leave. So you react and respond to the world accordingly. So when it comes to understanding our experiences, and specifically when it comes to understanding stress, we want to distinguish two very important factors: trigger and cause. So this is extremely important when it comes to understanding stress, because we unknowingly or passively attribute the cause of stress to the external world. And all we have to do is a little bit of self-reflection and we'll see that this is the case. Somebody says something to us or doesn't say something to us. There's a change in our external environment and we become frustrated, angry, disappointed, stressed. What we then do is blame the source of the stimulus. How do we know that we blame that, say, for example, that person? Well, because of the way that we respond to them. We respond to them with harsh words, with negative emotions. Whether we know it or not, we are essentially blaming that person for the way that we feel. So the person is the trigger, the environment is the trigger, but the cause of our stress is always and only internal. And this is an extremely important aspect for us to understand over and over again. I always give the same very simple example. I'm at a social event with my wife. I see her talking to a handsome stranger. I start to experience jealousy. It's a form of stress. I then look over and I blame the man, I blame my wife. So I go and I respond in a way which is socially aggressive or perhaps, whatever you can imagine. The fact that I'm responding in that way, I'm attributing the cause of my stress to those two people. How can I prove this to myself? Because that's where I deploy my efforts to try and make it stop. I interrupt their conversation. I do whatever I want to do, and as an attempt to make the stress go away. So I haven't maybe consciously called that the cause, but there is a tacit assumption that external stimulus is the cause of my stress, my jealousy in this example. The cause is always internal within us. The distinction between trigger and cause is something that we can make intellectually. It is much more difficult for us to make it in a way which is subjectively real for us, so that we actually start to deploy our efforts in the right place.
Can I ask a question, Lynn?
Please, jump in.
In that example that you have often said, say your wife is talking to somebody, it triggers some response and you get angry and one may get aggressive, so on and so forth. What would be the right Vedantic response, which is better for you? I know that what would be that? I mean, you may still feel angry, whatever.
So the right response, Vedanta doesn't tell you what the right response is.
Okay.
It can't. The response is determined by you according to your correct thinking. So how you respond to that environment, we can't say, because that will be dictated by a whole host of other factors. But as you put it, the Vedantic way to deal with that stress is to look for the cause and to address it there. So in a very simple example, and again, we've used this phrase before that the Swami has spoken about, Vedanta is a buffet of ideas.
Mhm.
And so the best way to manage that particular situation is to self-reflect, identify the cause, which is internal and self-created, and then to apply knowledge to that cause in the same way that you apply medicine to a wound. And what knowledge would you apply? Well, that's where the buffet of ideas comes in. So you apply knowledge of what you know to be true. And the second thing you do is that you return back to your ideal. And we'll get into that more as we go through this. So hold that thought in your mind. So you might say, for example, it's not her fault. It's not his fault. I am feeling jealous because of my attachment and possessiveness. If I were not attached and possessive, then the jealousy would not arise. This is knowledge. Now you return back to your ideal, or one of your ideals. Who do I want to be? I want to be someone who is mature and objective. I want to treat my wife the same way I would want to be treated by her, which is to have the freedom to have as many social interactions as I wish. I want to be free, so I should give freedom to others. It's a little bit like the quote from The Merchant of Venice. He says, "We do pray for mercy, and that same prayer doth teach us all to render the deeds of mercy." So because I pray for mercy, I have an obligation to give mercy to others. If I want to be free in my relationship as a human being, then I must give that freedom to others. So this is knowledge, this is an ideal. So this is the way that we would self-reflect. And we'll talk more about this as we go through, but this is reframing the experience. And this has the effect of cooling the whole thing off. So that angsty, tight, conflicted feeling of stress cools off. Now I decide how to respond. Okay, so now how do I respond? Leave her alone. Go get another drink and talk to your friend. Or you may go over there and say, just introduce yourself as a friend. However you choose to respond, it doesn't matter. So the response is not dictated by practical philosophy, but the internal work of releasing yourself from the clutches of stress, that is the purview of practical philosophy. So having an understanding of this trigger cause analysis is really important, because the moment I recognize the cause of my stress does not lie there, it lies here, then I can start to deal with it in the right place. So the triggers are always external, they are unavoidable. The world is full of triggers. We will never be able to be free from them, no matter where we go. And they are uncontrollable. Now, there's a little macron there you'll see. Basically, that means to an extent they are controllable. There are things you can do. But by and large, the world that we experience is not under our control. If anyone had said to any one of us 3 months ago, 4 months ago, there'll be over 30 million jobless soon, and you'll all be in lockdown, and et cetera, we'd think, you take your conspiracy theory somewhere else. And yet, this is exactly where we are. So compare that to causes of stress. So the causes are always internal. They are always self-created. And we'll get more into that as we go through. And this is where we do have control. This is the area of control that we have. And so this is where we should be working.
Okay, it's an internal work.
Yeah. So this idea of internal and external also is relative. We think of external meaning the world out there, but the triggers that give rise to stress can also emanate from our own body, mind, and intellect. I look at my body in the mirror, I feel stressed. I look at my mind, which is uncontrolled, which is full of negative emotions, which has bias and bigotry. I don't like it. It makes me stressed to see how I function. My own intellect is not clear enough. I just can't grasp what I need to grasp. These things can also be triggers for our stress. So internal and external, we need to have a very broad understanding of what that means. Our external triggers can also be our own body, mind, and intellect. So we're not going to go into these here. This is going to be the content for the next 6 weeks or so. But the broad causes of our stress we're going to discuss as our personal preferences, our likes and dislikes. I like it when the weather is warm. I don't like it when the weather is cold and windy. So what happens when I meet cold, windy weather? I'm stressed. So the preference gives rise to that sense of disappointment and angst. The rambling attention. So we find it difficult to stay on task. And this is especially true now if you're working from home. How difficult is it to stay in the work that you're supposed to be doing rather than everything else that can distract you in your home, especially if you have, say, young children running around. So our mind tends to run into the past and the future, which means that we aren't concentrating in the present. This gives us fatigue, and that whole running backwards and forwards itself is a mental agitation. Our ego-centered desires and attachments will also be large contributors to stress. Anytime we're experiencing a desire, we are experiencing a feeling of lacking something. And our ego-centered attachments essentially means that our stability is dependent on the world. We think of the idea of if you have just planted a sapling in the ground, it's not stable enough to stand on its own. The roots haven't gone in yet. The stem is still weak. So what do? You add some stakes and some ropes or some string. It's an attachment to keep it stable. What happens if the attachment is pulled, a passing animal knocks it out? Then the plant can't stand on its own, it falls. This is how our attachments function. They may have the feeling of keeping us stable, but the moment that object or being moves, what happens? My stability is lost. My mental stability can't stand on its own. So this also means that the world has leverage over us. Let's say, for example, you are attached to your reputation. You are now open to blackmail if you've done something wrong. If you don't give me what I want, I'm going to tell everybody what you did last summer. No, don't tell them. Imagine you have no attachment to your reputation. Yeah, go ahead, tell them whatever you like. The world has no leverage when we have no attachment. So these are the 4 broad aspects of our own minds that we're going to be covering, and we're going to be looking at exactly how we can start to address these. So when it comes to dealing with stress per se, there's different approaches that we're going to look at. The first is the worst of the good. So the bad way to deal with stress is not to manage it at all, and in fact to let stress dictate our responses. We're not even going to talk about that. We're at least talking about the idea of trying to deal with the stress that we have. Dealing with stress, the first way we're going to look at is managing it after it has arisen. So this is the example of, say, the jealous partner. The stress is existing in the personality now. So we have to do something with it. So the way that we deal with it is to redirect our attention. The reason that we're feeling stressed is because our attention is on the inner cause. Now, we may not know it to me, it doesn't feel like my attention's on my attachment and possessiveness for my partner. But that's exactly where it is. She's mine. Her attention is mine. Her affection is mine. Because my attention is there, now I can be triggered into stress. So the whole idea of managing stress after it has arisen is to redirect it. And again, we can deal with both the trigger and the cause in this way. So this is touching on the question that you asked earlier. The first thing is to reframe the experience itself. Reframe the stimulus that you have seen. So this is dealing with the thing that you're looking at. And let's stay with the same example. When you look at what you're observing from a more objective perspective, you see that there's nothing wrong there. You reframe it in terms of, and this is what we were touching on, every person should be free to have social interactions like normal adults. This reframing of the experience gives us a new perspective. So we're not looking at the same thing in the same way. There's a quote by the musician Steve Vai, something along the lines of, when you change the way that you look at a thing, the thing you're looking at changes. It's a great way to think about it. You actually change the thing that you are looking at by changing the way that you look at it, the perspective. And so we need some method of being able to reframe the experience. And so this is where and we're going to touch on this, our accurate assessment and our ideals in life start to come into play. The second aspect is self-reflection, which means identifying the cause. Why am I feeling jealous? Because my attachment and my possessiveness. Once we have identified the cause, we can simply look at it in terms of its value. If I recognize that the reason I'm feeling jealous is because of my attachment and possessiveness, the moment I see that for what it is, to that degree, the cause is deactivated or neutralized. You see it as being petty, immature. We can then take that a step further, as we touched on in the answer to your question, by addressing the cause with knowledge and our ideal. So a huge part of dealing with our stress, whether it's after the event, before the event, is to continue to take our minds back to our previously chosen ideals. And so this is going to be a part of the homework that we set for the 6-week course, is ideal setting. The moment I take myself back to the ideal, I am redirecting all of that stress energy into something that is now useful. Who am I right now? Someone who's petty and attached and possessive. Who do I want to be? Someone who's mature, who gives the same freedom that he wishes to enjoy. That's who I want to be. So I take my intellect and mind to that place, that ideal. There is a confluence of the mind and intellect. So what we have here is the intellect recognizing this is a worthwhile objective upon which to place my attention. And the intellect, and the mind feels good about it. So we're not forcing our mind onto something that just the intellect knows is useful or worthwhile. We're placing our mind onto something that the mind itself wants. So both the intellectual side and the emotional side must participate when we redirect our attention back towards our ideals. And so this is why having a a carefully chosen or a well-selected ideal is so important. Because if we try to coerce or force the mind onto something, well, my intellect says it's good, so I suppose I have to put my mind there, the mind will rebel, or at best, it simply won't participate, and it won't feel real for us. And if it doesn't feel real for us, then the redirection is not going to work. And so a big part of being able to understand this is having a clear understanding of what we mean by mind and intellect. The intellect is that aspect of the personality which thinks, which reasons, which knows things. The mind is that part of the personality which feels. And so the very simple and very powerful example that he gives in one of the texts is holding a sweet out to a diabetic. You hold a sweet to a diabetic, the mind wants it. It feels like it wants to take it. It's a feeling of, I want it, towards the sweet. And the intellect has knowledge, understanding, and rationality. It's a sweet. It's full of sugar. If we eat it, we'll get sick. Therefore, we should say no. Now, when you say this to the mind also now starts to appreciate, yeah, I want to be healthy, my ideal. And so saying no to the sweet is not forcing or coercing the mind. It's not trapping the mind. It's reminding the mind about physical health. Yeah, I like feeling healthy. So saying no, I feel good about that now. So we have redirected our feelings, the mind, by the thinking of the intellect. This is the whole process. But we have to know where we are taking our thinking to. This is the purpose of creating ideals before we need them. So this is how we're going to touch on or work with managing stress once it's already active within the personality. A better way to deal with stress is to manage it before it arises. So in a sense, what we're trying to do is to separate the trigger and the cause so they don't come together. Again, it's like having two dogs. You know that if they come together during feeding time, they're going to start fighting. So what do? You feed one on the porch and you feed another in the yard. Keep them separated. No conflict. So what we're trying to do here is to separate the trigger from the cause. Now, there's different ways we can understand this. The first is what you might call physical distancing. And an example here is social media. I have spoken to at least 3 or 4 people that I can think of who have said that since being in lockdown, their social media consumption has got out of hand and it's making them so agitated. And so they have to delete the Instagram or delete the Facebook from their phones just so they don't contact it. So this is physical distancing. The trigger, the stimulus, is the social media feed, whether it's the barrage of bad news or whether it's the social comparison because everyone's having such a beautiful time in lockdown or whatever it happens to be. That trigger, I'm going to reduce the trigger because I know it affects my cause. And so this is done by proper scheduling. You can't live without social media if that's part of your nature. To cut yourself off from that part of life isn't a correct method. So you schedule it. You have set limits. So this is one thing we'll touch on. A more important aspect is what you might call mental distancing. So what does that mean? Let's go back to our earlier example. What I'm trying to do with this mental distancing or managing stress before it arises is keeping my mind aloft in a place so that it's non-conducive for the stress to arise. And so there are scheduled daily practices that we can put in place. There is ideal setting. This all helps to keep the mind aloft. Take a simple example. One of the ones that we're going to go through is a gratitude practice. So if we have a daily or twice weekly gratitude practice, what actually happens to our mind? Okay, so we create an atmosphere within us of thankfulness. And part of that will be, hopefully, I'm thankful that I have this person in my life. I'm thankful for what he or she brings. The moment we have that feeling of gratitude within our personality, it becomes that much more difficult to be triggered. Take another example, which is perhaps a little easier to grasp. If you have a sense of gratitude that you still have a job since the pandemic struck, let's say that you are walking into your workplace and there's a line because everybody has to have their temperature checked and they have to be given their mask and so on and so forth. So you're standing in line for an hour before you go to work. Are you going to be frustrated? Are you going to be agitated? No, you're so thankful that you still have a job that it's impossible that standing in a line for an hour can create stress. Whereas previously, if I had to stand in line for anything for more than 10 minutes, I start moaning to myself and say, well, who's managing this place? So go ahead.
So in terms of gratitude practice, are you saying that our gratitude practice should be directed towards the thing that actually causes the agitation? We are looking for things to be appreciative of towards those things that are the triggers?
You can. There's no hard and fast rules. In terms of keeping the attention aloft, it's having a general sense of gratitude. So if a person has a general sense of well-being associated with knowing or being aware of the fact that I have or that I'm enjoying certain privileges, then it doesn't have to be associated with those specific areas of life that do tend to cause me stress. So you can think of it a bit like taking an antibiotic and treating a wound. Let's say that you cut your foot. I'm not a doctor, so this might not be correct, but the point is made. You cut your foot. Now, to ensure that you don't get some sort of infection, you take a broad spectrum antibiotic. At the same time, you may put specific antiseptics onto that wound. So your gratitude practice can be a bit like that. I'm going to develop a general sense of gratitude for the life that I have. That's like the broad spectrum antibiotic. It might not be directed at anything in particular, but it will have a buffering effect for specific events. But also, if I know I am attached and possessive over my partner, that may be like the antiseptic on the wound. I know that I have to pay special attention to this area because I'm so attached. So you would do both, but you shouldn't, or it might be better to say, you wouldn't be able to necessarily pick out everything that's going to trigger you and find a reason to be grateful. Then it becomes a bit too contrived, a bit too cumbersome, and it would lose the effect. So something like a gratitude practice must flow freely. There has to be that internal space to allow the emotion to arise. And if we try to force it too much, then it becomes too much of an intellectual exercise and we're not giving space for the emotions to really flow. So it's a mixture of both. So that's the idea of managing stress before it arises, because I know I have these causes. So there's a beautiful quote in the Bhagavad-Gita. This is in chapter 6. He says, as a lamp in a windless place does not flicker, That simile reflects a yogi with subdued mind, practicing union with the self. What does this mean? So the main point is this idea of a lamp in a windless place does not flicker. So when a flame is surrounded by a shade, it is protected by the wind, it is protected from the wind, and so it doesn't flicker and move around. So too, when we put consistent practices in place, that acts like a shield or a barrier around our mind, a buffer, so that when the world comes flowing past it, it doesn't flicker and move and get agitated. And so this is one of the ways that we can understand this, that spiritual disciplines protect the mind from the onslaughts of desire and render it steady. This is the way he describes it in the commentary. So the practices help to keep the mind steady before we have actually eliminated the causes. So the causes of stress are still there. I'm still possessive. I'm still attached. But I know that by maintaining certain scheduled daily disciplines, I'm essentially putting a little wind shade around my mind so that when the world of stimuli comes flying past, it stays relatively steady. The best way of dealing with stress is to eliminate the cause itself. Sure, stress is in the personality, so redirect it when it arises. Sure, the causes are in my personality, but I know if I do this, there's less chance of them turning into stress. Better yet, get rid of the causes and stress cannot arise no matter what stimuli we interact with. And so this is our definition, if you like, of knowledge or wisdom. Wisdom is the insight that we have that eliminates the causes of stress from their root. This is our definition of self-development or spiritual growth. These are all synonyms. So the consistent practice of spiritual disciplines has this effect. And we're going to touch on those. And for those of you that are already familiar, you'll know that it is gratitude and devotion for the mind, study and self-reflection for the intellect, and acts of service for the body. So when we schedule these into our life, we're not just keeping stress at bay, we are actually beginning to remove the causes of stress. But all of these practices have as their base the identification, if you like, or attunement to an ideal. So this is something that we're going to discuss in a lot more detail as we go through. An ideal is a goal that we set for ourselves that lies outside our own personal, egocentric demands. It doesn't mean that we negate our egocentric demands. I want to make money. I want to be rich. I want to be famous on the Instagram. I want to be loved by my peers because it caters to my ego. If you want those things, by all means have them. We're not saying don't. But what we're saying is that we should also look to add on top of that other goals that do not cater directly to my ego or to my self-interest. And so what we're going to be doing across the course and for some of the homework is to develop ideals and the different fields of activity where we spend our attention. So what do we mean by this? So this is something that takes a relatively small amount of self-analysis. Where do I spend my attention? So we may be very good at this when it comes to our finances. I balance my checkbooks At the end of every month, I go through my bank statements. I know exactly how much I'm spending on utilities and gas and entertainment and so on and so forth. Do I know where I'm spending my attention, my thoughts? This is also a resource, a currency. A good analogy is, for example, if you were to look at the history of your internet browsing, you could categorize it. Okay, this is my politics interest. This is where I spend my time watching cat videos. This is where I spend my time catching up with friends and family on Facebook. And you could, broadly speaking, start to figure out, okay, I spend most of my time on the internet looking at politics, etc. So too, the self-analysis process, we start to figure out what are the main areas where I'm spending my attention. And you will come up with your own here. So you might decide, or you might identify that I spend most of my attention on my work and career. I'm spending at least 8 hours a day doing it. I'm also thinking about how I can advance it and so on and so forth. A large chunk of my time gets consumed, or my attention gets consumed by my partner and my family. This is my social life. I've also got some volunteering that I do. And I've got my gym workouts in the morning and so on and so forth. So broadly speaking, we should have an ideal in each of these fields of activity, because all of these fields of activity will have triggers. Work and career, it triggers me. I mean, someone who is less qualified than me passes over me and they get the promotion, stress. Partners and family, okay, enough said. Even our social life and our recreation can cause us stress. Feelings of, oh, I have to go to so-and-so's wedding, whatever. So for each of these, managing stress means being able to draw our attention back towards our ideal. And so these are things that we're going to generate for ourselves. And we're going to offer some examples or some ideas as to what ideals may be. And these will come from the different texts. So this is something that we'll work through. So we need to find an ideal where our intellect, the thinking, reasoning part says, yes, this makes sense. This is worthwhile pursuing. And yes, I can also see it doesn't directly cater to my self-interest. And the mind, the feeling part, will also say, yeah, I would like to be that more and more. So this will constitute our ideal. So we don't have it on here, but overarching this whole process is the ideal of self-development or spiritual growth. These are, again, synonyms. If we are directing our attention towards our ideals in these different fields of activity, what that means is that we are practicing self-development. So self-development is not another segment of the pie chart. Self-development now becomes something that we integrate into every segment of the pie chart. So let's say you are a religious person and you say, well, I spend, an hour on Fridays doing my ritual here, and every second Thursday I do this. That's not what we mean by self-development. Self-development is woven into the different fields of activity. So that's looking essentially at the way that we are going to address the causes of stress that lie within the inner personality. Any quick questions on that before we sort of shift focus a little bit to the idea of the trigger?
Was there, is there something about those 5 categories that you listed? Does that indicate more balance?
No.
I'm just curious to know how, why these specific 5 categories.
These are just examples. You will come up with your own categories. I imagine that there'll be some here that find themselves in your own assessment, because we all have attention going to work and career. And again, what we're measuring is our attention, not necessarily the time spent. You might say, well, I'm out of a job now, so that's down to 0. No, in fact, I spend more time thinking about work and career now that I don't have a job. So there's nothing special about these categories. It's just where I recognize I spend most of my thoughts and feelings.
Okay.
Okay. So when it comes to the triggers, it can be anything. And the relevant aspects that we're experiencing now, of course, with regards to the pandemic, things like job losses, as we've already discussed, illness, our own, that of our loved ones, being in lockdown. This is clearly going to be a cause of stress for us, or rather, see there, even the language is hard. That's clearly going to be a trigger for our stress. Broadly speaking, we're going to call a lot of these things uncertainty. So when we go through the analysis of uncertainty as a trigger, you can really think of this as an example or a placeholder and put in any of the other triggers that you may have identified. But we're going to work with uncertainty because this is also a powerful trigger for so many of us at the moment. We don't know really even what's going on with the pandemic, yet alone what things will be like next week, next month, 6 months from now. And so that uncertainty has a huge effect on our mental state. So we need to try and address that particular aspect head on. So when we talk about dealing with the uncertainty, again, there are different ways that we can approach it. The first is to remove it, if it's possible. So this is done by planning, by thinking, and by acting. So what's an example of an uncertainty that we can actually remove?
Get tested to find out if you have COVID or not.
Yeah, exactly. Do I have the virus? I was in contact with that guy in the store and he was sweating and coughing and he touched the same object that I did when I purged it from him. I feel like so you go on the website, you can be tested. You plan for it, you act on it, and you get your test back. Yes, you have the virus, or no, you don't have the virus. The uncertainty is removed. This is great if you can do it, but for most of the uncertainty that we face, removal is going to be less likely. Second thing we can do is to mitigate it. So what this means is that we recognize that there is some uncertainty with regard to some area of life. And so we put preparation in place so that we mitigate not just the uncertainty, but the way that we relate to the uncertainty. What might be an example of the preparation to mitigate an uncertainty?
All the social distancing, don't go to crowded places. With COVID-19, we're decreasing the chances.
Yeah, you could think of that. I don't know if that person has it. I don't know if I'm going to catch it. So what can you do? Well, you can wash your hands at every opportunity.
Yeah.
You can do your social distancing. So you're not removing the uncertainty of, say, catching the virus, but you're mitigating it by putting the adequate preparation in place. Also, a little bit along these lines is something like having an earthquake plan. When will it happen? I don't know. How bad will it be? I don't know. Where will I be? I don't know. Where will my loved ones be? I don't know. How will I contact them? I don't know. So what do? Create an earthquake plan. Make sure everybody knows about it. Where are my important documents? I know where they are. Where are the backups? I know where they are. What are we going to do if we can't contact each other? I know exactly what we're going to do. Where are we going to meet? I know where we're going to meet, etc. So having a preparation for something helps to mitigate the uncertainty, if not remove it. And by mitigating it, of course, the uncertainty has less of an effect on our mental state. So there's nothing particularly self-development oriented around these two approaches. This is really just a common sense approach to uncertainty. But a more internal or self-development aspect is to work again inwardly. Certain uncertainties are going to be unavoidable. The uncertainty is not the problem. The problem is the way that we are relating to the uncertainty. So again, the uncertainty is the trigger. And so we say, all of this uncertainty is driving me mad. No, it's not the uncertainty driving us mad. It's the way that we're relating to it. If we can accept the uncertainty, then what happens is we relax. The uncertainty has not gone anywhere. It hasn't changed or diminished. But our anxiety and angst has, because we have accepted, we are learning to live with the uncertainty. So this comes through an accurate assessment. So anytime we want to learn to accept something, we make an accurate assessment of what it actually is. We face it head on. What's a very common example where we do this a lot? We accept the uncertainty. Anybody married?
I was going to say driving on a freeway at 80 miles an hour.
Driving on a freeway, correct. You don't know if your ball joint's about to go out, or your tire's going to go out, or that you may be driving perfectly, but the idiot behind you is the one who's texting on his phone. So yeah, there's uncertainty driving on the freeway, but you accept it. And so you're not terrified when you're on the freeway knowing that I might have an accident. We go into a marriage, utterly uncertain that that person is going to remain faithful to us, that it's going to last the distance. But we accept it. We accept the uncertainty through faith. How does our faith come into existence? Where does it come from? It comes from an accurate assessment. Faith isn't something that is just born in the mind. Faith doesn't come from your affection towards your partner. That's not where it comes from. That can help to create a conducive environment for it, but that's not the seed. The seed of that acceptance is a correct understanding of the way things are. First of all, yeah, my partner has demonstrated high morals. Second, she has professed that she's going to be faithful. I have no reason to disbelieve her. And I also know that she's a free agent to act as she will. She may. It might happen. So the acceptance arises from the assessment. So this is something else that we're going to cover in more detail. The other thing that we can do when it comes to dealing with uncertainty, and uncertainty here we can think of as a synonym for instability, is to generate stability. So we generate, first of all, an external stability. So what this means is that we give ourselves a template for our activities, for our day, what a friend of mine calls rhythm and rigor. So for those of you who have visited the Vedanta Academy in India, you'll know every day is exactly the same, and every single moment of that daily schedule from 4:30 a.m. till 9 p.m. has an activity scheduled in. Study, yoga, exercise, breakfast, class, etc., all the way through. When you start to live a scheduled daily life, your mind fits into that groove. There's a great set of interviews and research done by the Human Sleep Research Center up at Berkeley. And he was asked a question, one of the directors was asked a question a number of years ago. What's the number one thing you would advise to get good, sound sleep? He said, go to sleep the same time every evening and wake up the same time every morning, Monday through Sunday. So we often don't see it, but we should not underestimate the calming and stabilizing effect that a regular routine has on our minds. So this is something that we're also going to work to create. More important than that, because external stability is also not perfect, life happens, is to create an internal stability. So what this means is that there is something within me which is stable even when the external is changing. This is our ideal of self-development. It gives us a subtler purpose in life so that we can continue with that subtler purpose even if the world changes around me. So take all of these examples. I have the higher purpose, the ideal of self-development, which means the reduction of immaturity, the reduction of egocentric desires, selfishness, etc. It's internal work. Okay, so I'm in a beautiful marriage. I must do my self-development to sustain it. Now the marriage starts to get on the rocks. Does it change my self-development practice? No, it's still there. Now my wife has divorced me. Does it change my self-development practice? No, I'm still stable in that. I'm poor. Okay, so I do my self-development practice. I win the lottery. I still do my self-development practice. I lose all that money again. Self-development practice remains. So by having a subtler purpose in life, which is not dependent on any of our circumstances, what we're doing is developing an internal stability. So this is again going to help us manage or deal with external instability or uncertainty. And especially relevant, and this is something that a couple of people have actually asked me to address, so this is why this is in here, is of course the idea of health, ill health, and death. So death offers us both certainty and uncertainty. It's going to happen. What's it going to be like for us? We don't know. When, how, and what happens after it, we don't know. So there is a tremendous benefit to our psychological well-being if we face the prospect and the reality of death head on. You may be familiar with the book, I think it's something like 5 Regrets of the Dying. It was written by a palliative care nurse. And the idea of relating to our own death gives us a tremendous sense of freedom here and now. So we want to be able to approach or manage the idea of death in a way that continuously improves our mental state from today. And what we're going to use for these are the thought experiments of causation and reincarnation. So I want to say this from the outset. There is no necessity to actually believe in the law of causation or the theory of reincarnation. It's utterly immaterial. It's a thought experiment. So I have a great comparison to this, because the idea of reincarnation sometimes scares people off in the sense that, oh, here we go for, it's crazy talk, or it's religious. Nothing like that. So there is a thought experiment that was created by John Rawls in the 1970s. It's a veil of ignorance thought experiment. It's basically the idea of standing behind a veil, and on the other side of the veil is a society. And your job is to create a fair society. So you're going to distribute resources, you're going to distribute opportunities, you're going to create laws, you're going to do all of the things that create a society, but you don't know who you are going to be in that society. Are you going to be a male or a female? You don't know. So how do I want genders to be treated? Are you going to be born rich or poor? You don't know. So what do you want access to healthcare, to education to be? Someone else talks about this and they say, okay, imagine you decide that 50% of the people in your society are going to be slaves. Then you have a 50% chance of being a slave. Do I really want to take that risk? Now, what's the point of all this? If you stand behind the veil of ignorance, of knowing who you're going to be born as in that society, it gives you a brand new perspective on how that society should be created. It's an impossibility. But the fact that it's impossible is actually useful because it gives us some detachment from the thought experiment. In the same way, causation and reincarnation are thought experiments. And in fact, it's going to be more useful if you don't believe in them, because then you are more free to actually use them. So we have a long quote there from John Rawls' book, which we won't go into, just because we've sort of described it as it is. But the idea is that no one's going to know their place in the society. And so when we have that stark realization, all of a sudden we will give ourselves a much better chance of creating a much more fair and equitable society, because I could be anyone. I could be born to a single parent family in a low socioeconomic group, and I am physically disabled. So what do I want my society to look like? So this is the thought experiment. So when it comes to the law of causation, we're going to look at it in terms of some very familiar ideas. You reap what you sow. How I act now will determine what I experience later. Another phrase, we can think about it as the consumer becomes the consumed. Very interesting in terms of our COVID-19 crisis. Where has it come from? How have we been treating our natural environment? How have we been treating our animals? Look at the way that we treat pigs, cattle, chickens. We lock them up in pens. We restrict their freedom of movement. They're squashed in together. How are we being treated at the moment? Lockdown. And there's a beautiful line from the Beatles. And in the end, the love you take is equal to the love you make. So this is the law of causation, and we're going to use this thought experiment framework for assessing the way that we relate to our environment and to the people in it, the beings in it, on a day-to-day basis. We don't have to believe that you actually reap what you sow. You don't have to believe that the world is morally just. But think about it as an experiment. And the same with the theory of reincarnation, which states that at the end of this life, there's an indeterminate period where we spend some time somewhere, undisclosed location, And then we are born into a new environment that is perfectly suited to the personality that I left with. As you think, so you become. I am creating my personality with every thought, with every feeling, and with every response. So if that's the case, what is the environment that I will be born into? So again, we don't have to believe it. Probably better if we don't. What is the personality that I am creating right now, and 1 minute from now, and 1 day from now, and 1 year from now? And how much time do I have to improve it so that if I were to be born in an environment soon after my death, it would be the one that is most conducive for my happiness? So confronting death using these two conceptual frameworks is going to be the way that we're going to look at that particular aspect of life. Any questions on any of that before we get into a little bit about the structure? Okay, so each of the classes will have a theory aspect where we'll touch on the causes of stress through that receipt, reaction, response mechanism. We'll talk about how that cause can be managed. And then we're going to look at how we can practically apply it. What can we actually do based on the theory that we've discussed? So managing the triggers, managing the causes, and creating ideals. This is the practical aspect. The homework, if you choose to take it up, will be practicing the practices, actually doing the things that we're talking about in the sessions as classes. And it'll be some other things that we're going to need in order to practice them. So for example, you can't practice taking your attention towards an ideal if you don't have one. So ideal setting is going to be a practice or a homework. Daily introspection, so that we start to get an idea of where we are spending our time. Implementing a gratitude practice and just experimenting, seeing what effect it has on the personality. This will be some of the homework aspects. Some of you already know that we have Q&A sessions on a Friday morning. As you go through this, you will hopefully have questions about the theory, the practice. You will hopefully also come up against challenges when you try to put it into practice that won't work. So formulate your questions, send those through to me, and we will discuss them in that session. All of these sessions will be available online for a week after they are finished. So you can go back and review. And if you can't make one of the sessions, you can just view it online. And finally, if there are aspects of this that you specifically want to address, again, please let me know. So the death one was something that a couple of people have asked me specifically to address. If there are other areas that you want talked about to help you through them, we'll use those as material for the discussion. So if you are not already signed up for our mailing list, you can go to our website, which is vedantala.org. You'll see there. Sign up for the newsletter. You'll get some more information about these upcoming classes, how you can register. It's a different Zoom link from the one that you are currently on. So you'll need to register for that particular link. If you have any other questions, queries, suggestions, or otherwise, please contact me at any point. Anything people want to know or ask at this point?
Is there a way that we can pass this information on to friends that might be interested in taking this course?
Yeah, I'll send another. The email that we sent out yesterday and this today has the links towards the Eventbrite page for this, which has some details on it. Another email will be coming out during the week So if you're on our mailing list, you can forward that to people that you know. If you can sign them up on their behalf, if you get their permission, of course, and then they will also get the information about this.
Thanks, Glenn.
Thanks, Paul.
All right.
Thanks, Glenn.
Thanks, Manish.
Thank you. Hari Om.
Thanks, everyone. Hari Om.
Thank you.
Thank you, Glenn. Hari Om.
Ruhi.
Glenn.
I'm so offended.
That was Ruhi, by the way. She's offended you didn't acknowledge her.
Thank you.